Welcome to Releasing Trauma, a Survivor's Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. I am a survivor of emotional bullying, rape, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and grief. After losing my husband in 2019, I set off on a new adventure to help other women release their trauma and create a life they can cherish. Each week, I will feature a guest expert or a survivor to share their stories, tips, wisdom, and more. The goal is so that you can take away even just the smallest nugget of information you can use in your life right now to make a change, and to remind you that you're not alone. There is life after trauma, and you can move from victim to thriver and create a life you can cherish. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Tracy Osborne. With me today is Dr. Roseann Capanna-Hodge. We're going to talk about neurofeedback and how that affects trauma, or how that affects releasing your trauma, actually. So, Dr. Roseann, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
I am so excited to have this conversation because I want people who've experienced trauma to realize there are different solutions and that there aren't limits on healing. And that's what neurofeedback can do for people.
Well, I'm excited to dive into that. But before we do, I like to have our listeners hear a little bit about our guests. So why don't you give us a little bit about your backstory?
Yeah. So I'm a therapist, a psychologist, and for 30 years, I have been supporting children, adults, families with every clinical issue you can possibly imagine. And I've done a lot of work with those who've experienced trauma of different forms. I've actually was one of the approved providers for Sandy Hook. I have worked with a lot of people with medical trauma, and I have had the privilege of helping thousands of people reduce and reverse mental health symptoms using only proven holistic therapies, including neurofeedback, really specific types of psychotherapy. We only do trauma-informed care. We really believe in somatic experiencing and EFT tapping. Not that other therapies aren't great, but we really believe in trauma-informed care. And I'm just this woman who's on a mission to change the way we view and treat mental health, which is why I am really become sort of this media personality and now have been on hundreds of TV shows, podcasts, and have been in a lot of publications. I'm really trying to open up the dialogue about mental health and to change what people think about how they can get better, because there really are so many ways people can improve. And it really starts with the individual learning about these things, but taking little actions to create big waves.
Absolutely. We've got to come forward and use our voices to help beat the stigma around mental health and around trauma. And so the only way we're going to do that is for people like you and me to get out there and talk and educate and inform other people.
Well said. And that's really the truth. And that's what I love about podcasts, is because we can have a deep conversation that can really create these aha moments for people. Like, I've never heard about this, and I know there'll be people listening right now that have never heard about neurofeedback, how evidence-based and how powerful it is. And which is so exciting, because there are going to be people that their lives are going to change. Many of my clients with trauma call it a game changer. I mean, how awesome is that? So this is really a wonderful opportunity for people to learn about different ways to heal. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, let's talk about it. What is neurofeedback? What does that mean?
Yeah. So neurofeedback is a way to actually change the brain waves in the brain, which then impact our neurotransmitters, and it really gets the brain to regulate. So it's done through this really simple process, and I'll paint the picture and explain it to people. But what happens when somebody is traumatized from a total neuroscience perspective is the brain gets in a hyperactive, stress activated state. And our body has a system called the autonomic nervous system. And that system is supposed to help us regulate our stress responses. And in a relaxed state, it's called the parasympathetic state. And when you're in a stress state, it's called the sympathetic dominant state. And, as adults, right, we realize that, and for regardless of what age you're at, we face stressors every day, and our body knows no difference between good and bad stressors. Excitement can stress the body too. I'm in the middle of a book launch and, I'm not sleeping, even though I'm doing everything I can. I just have a lot of excitement going on. So my nervous system gets stressed activated. And with trauma, what happens is the nervous system gets stuck on in that sympathetic state. And that's why people get activated, right? And our subconscious is constantly picking up different cues around us. We may become sensory stimulated by noise, light, just different things. And people that have experienced trauma are like, what is going on? Why is my body doing this? So how does neurofeedback fit into this? Well, it is a 50-year-old evidence-based approach with thousands of research studies, 3,000 peer-reviewed studies for a variety of conditions, but there's a lot of research with trauma. And how does it work? So neurofeedback, typically how it starts is this. Somebody comes to a person like me where I work with people in person and virtually, and we either do a brain map if you're close enough, right, which gives us a visual representation of the health of the brain by looking at the formation of brain waves, both over the structure, and then I can actually see what's called the neural networks. I can see how the brain is talking to itself, and we'll dive into that a little bit. Or I do statistical brain checks where we send people the equipment before they get started. We do averages based on EEG data. And that tells me which region is working, which region isn't. What does that mean? It means that some areas may be stuck on, maybe overactive, and some areas may be lower activity. This does not mean intelligence. This means processing. And a classic brain that's been impacted by trauma, what you're going to see is too much inner chatter in the brain. No surprise there, right? So you're going to see what we call hyperconnectivity, where the brain gets stuck on because you're in the stress activated state. And many people who I work with who've had trauma, the visual centers of the brain in the occipital region actually turn off to protect itself from the constant visual activation, because visual activation is more common in trauma than auditory activation, meaning you're going to have flashes that are going to come into your brain. Some people hear sounds of, different things that have happened to you, whether it's somebody screaming or maybe a loud noise if you were in some kind of accident. Everybody's trauma and our idea of what trauma is has so expanded. So that's the part of what happens and what we're looking for. Well, the next part in neurofeedback is, I determine protocols for people. I'm certified. I have, years and years and years of experience, thousands of clients that I've worked with over the years doing neurofeedback. And what does a session actually do? And what does it look like? So it's going to regulate that brain. So your brain is stuck on. And then in the case for most people, we have areas in the back of the brain that is off, right? So what's the first thing I do with somebody with trauma is calm down that inner chatter, right? And when you calm down that inner chatter, you start reducing activation in the brain. And so you're not getting all of this constant activation, a sound, a smell, a song. And when that activation is happening, and anybody who's had a traumatic experience knows exactly what I'm talking about, you involuntarily start to notice with an activation. You might have chest tightening, you might feel agitation, you might feel sadness. And there's a sense of I feel out of control, right? So we're our body is overactivating, our mind is overactivating. And many people with trauma try to disconnect or they try different healthy approaches. They try talk therapy, they try all kinds of things. Talk therapy can be notably very activating for a person because we're trying to deal with things through the conscious awareness when it's our subconscious that is being activated. And that's the power of neurofeedback. So your subconscious is what I'm training. So what does that look like? You're like, okay, Roseann, nervous system is activated. Neurofeedback helps to regulate the nervous system so it's not reacting to things. And then we get you down into the autonomic nervous system. We get you down to a more relaxed parasympathetic state. That's the science behind it. So how does it do that? Well, after you have this brain map, you're hooked up. And you have sensors typically you have them on your ears and at one or two places on your head that your provider is determining. And you're going to change your brain waves based on the reinforcement, auditory and visual reinforcement you receive. Well, what is that? Okay. Well, for most providers like myself, you're going to watch a movie. And the movie is set up through software, specially designed software, that won't play unless your brain changes itself, right? Produces that exact healthy combination of brainwaves that I predetermined that I need you to experience in order for this movie to play. Dings, points, all these visual auditory reinforcements. Well, the mind-blowing part about neurofeedback, Tracy, is that within 2 to 3 seconds of the first time you are hooked up, your subconscious picks up on these cues, these subconscious cues, and says, oh, I want, let's just say, number one movie in the office, Back to the Future. I want Back to Future to play, Back to the Future. And in order for that to happen, I've got to cut down this hyper communication in my brain and calm it down, right? And then improve this calm brainwave. Well, it happens. And this is what happens every single time, regardless of age, regardless if you believe it works, you like it. Your subconscious, which is in control 95 to 99.5% of the time, is really what is the dominant level of what you're in any moment. Is your subconscious running the show. Not to say you're not awake and consciousness isn't there, but your subconscious is always the dominant force most of the time. And so when you're doing a session, you instantaneously start producing this healthy combination of brain waves. And just like working out, you can't do it one time. You must do a series to change the set point, what we call homeostasis. So your set point is this unhealthy rhythm and profile in your brain, right? And over time, you move your set point through a process of that reinforcement, just like working out at the gym, building a muscle. And most people, a bare minimum of sessions, I mean, bare minimum is 20, but most people are doing 40 or more because the brain is resistant to change. And, the outcome and what you're looking for is reduction in symptoms that are unique to each person with trauma, but certainly every person who's had trauma has activation, right, of some type of bodily somatic activation, increased heart rate, sweating, agitation, chest pain, headaches, right? This is what happens in trauma. So we're looking for reduction in there. And then whatever other symptoms people have, maybe it's anxiety related issues, maybe it's depression, maybe it's anger. So that's the process of neurofeedback. It's amazing. Through research, we know as far as 10 years out that the changes that are produced in these sessions are lasting over time, which is really pretty incredible. And the magic juju of neurofeedback occurs when you pair it with psychotherapy related to trauma therapy.
How does it work with like neuro-linguistic programming?
I love NLP, and I'm a rare psychologist and therapist who likes NLP. So neuro-linguistic programming is not often used in psychotherapy. It's used a lot with coaches. It's used a lot with hypnotists, right, Tracy?
Right.
And here's why I love NLP, right? It's different from cognitive behavioral therapy. So what's the overlap between cognitive behavioral and NLP? And first of all, I think these are great tools for when your nervous system is not as activated. And I'll explain that. But the overlap between the two is they're focusing on changing your cognitions so that you can take action differently. What's different about NLP is it's very, very positively future thinking oriented. And there's a lot of visualization pieces. And it really does involve more of the underpinnings of positive psychology than cognitive behavioral, right? Cognitive behavioral does a lot of looking backwards to move forward, where NLP is always trying to get you to future think and really start painting that visual picture of success, which I'm a huge fan of. I mean, I've been doing guided visualizations forever. But it is a wonderful pairing of, with neurofeedback, because you get your body regulated enough where you're not so activated and constantly in this fight, flight, or freeze mode, where you can then start to think differently, to take action differently. I mean, so many people with trauma are frozen because their nervous system is frozen.
Right. We're stuck at the point where our trauma has occurred.
Absolutely. And not to give up your power, but from a science perspective, it's because of the nervous system activation. And neurofeedback is an incredibly powerful tool. I mean, we know, the big guru in trauma, Bessel van der Kolk, is a huge proponent of neurofeedback. Many people have read his book and have found me because of that book. They're like, wow, I've never heard of neurofeedback. And, we have this man who really talks about the somatic response of the body. So we love to pair somatic experiencing with neurofeedback, because what happens to everybody in trauma, regardless of your age, is there is a natural, unhealthy response to try to disconnect from the uncomfortableness that comes with these activations, which means you want to disconnect from your body, right?
Right. So
you feel chest pain, right? Who the heck wants to stay in that? So you start disconnecting. Sometimes it's dissociative things like, I'm going to watch Netflix for days at a time. Sometimes it's alcohol. Sometimes it's prescriptions. I mean, there's lots of ways that people disconnect at a totally subconscious level, Tracy.
Yeah.
And so somatic experiencing is this very base component that teaches people to safely reconnect so that they can pay attention to the cueing system of their body, because we want you to create a window of tolerance where you're like, wait a second. Every time I'm with my Aunt Betty, I feel chest pain. Why? And then really starting to unpack that and get behind that so that you break these trigger patterns is really incredible. But the power of neurofeedback is you're able to regulate your system and create space for activation without getting to this maximum capacity. Because to me, that's what fight, flight, or freeze is. This is a primitive response that's protective in the body, but it's our max capacity. It's really easy with constant activation to get in a fight, flight, or freeze mode. And you don't have to have trauma to get in fight, flight, or freeze. Chronic stress, anxiety, mental health issues can push you to that limit as well. So we just have found it to be just a very powerful combination to combine neurofeedback, somatic experience, and then do NLP, CBT, DBT, do these other therapies, because you have the cognitive power to be able to think clearly enough to take action.
Wow, this has been really interesting, and I'm sure we could probably talk about this for another hour or so, but We are almost out of time, and I want to make sure people know how to reach you. So where can they find you if they have more questions about neurofeedback and how it works?
Yeah. So you can find me everywhere under Dr. Roseann, Drroseanne. ANN. Let me say that again, Drroseann. And you can go to drroseann.com. You also can go to Amazon and get my books. I have a book called Teletherapy Toolkit for therapists, but I also just wrote a book called It's Gonna Be Okay. And it's proven ways to reverse your child's mental health. And it really is written for parents, but the 8 pillars of hope and healing are really designed for reversing mental health symptoms of any age. It's just that our mental health of our children are such a precarious position right now and have been for a very long time that I want parents to really be empowered.
Awesome. And listeners, if you're on the website, or, if you're on the website, everything is on the show notes right there, just like I always do. If you're listening on any of our partner stations, go to releasingtraumapodcast.com, pull up Dr. Roseann's interview, all her links, the links to her books, everything will be right there for you in one easy spot. So, Dr. Roseann, thank you so much for joining us. This is a fascinating subject. And, we may have to have you back on the show at a later date to talk about it some more.
I would love to. And I just want to always say to people, don't let anybody limit your possibility of healing. There's so many ways to help regulate your brain and your body so that you can feel better.
I love that. Thank you. And listeners, as always, thank you so much for listening to the show. We'll talk to you next week.